or no?
We commonly don't. We just did the 4 vows. If you want to lead a chant, by all means.
No, that's okay.
I'm recording.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Good morning, everybody. It doesn't seem any colder in Chicago than it does here in California right now. It's odd, that we meet one another in this way. And maybe sometime I can visit you in Chicago, which is a great town. And I hope everybody is all right in these dramatic times. But I think that probably for us Dharma students, the pandemic is easier than it is for most people because it's our practice, right? To see expansiveness where there's limitation, right? We see what could be more limiting than a sesshin, and yet when we sit a sesshin, we are fully expanded in all directions. So we can see expansion and limitation. And we don't mind silence and non-doing. These are our friends in practice. So for us, I hope we feel like the pandemic is not so bad for us personally, although I'm sure, like all of you, we feel the grief all around us, the difficulty all around us. And I actually think that in our time, grieving is a spiritual practice that we all engage in. It's an important practice to really take in with a real sense of grief, what's going on all around us. Even so, I'm doing all right, and I hope you are too. So our practice is bodhisattva practice. Practice not just for ourselves, but to benefit others. Compassion is at the heart of our practice. Concern for others, love for sentient beings. That's our essential practice. But bodhisattva practice isn't possible without the emptiness teachings, because it's the emptiness teachings and our appreciation of them and our living of them that open up the space and clear the ground for bodhisattva love. I guess, like all other Zen temples around the world, you chant also the Heart Sutra every day. Maybe when you chant the words, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no taste, no touch, no attainment. Maybe when you chant all this, it doesn't sound like love and compassion, but that's what it is. Because all dharmas are empty doesn't mean that things don't exist or that somehow things are pale and somber and barely here. It doesn't mean that. It means the opposite of that. Things are vividly here. Here without limitations or boundaries, not stuck and small and painful as they might seem to us sometimes. All dharmas are empty. Brings you the good news that you are empty of you, and I am empty of me. There's nothing to protect, nothing to fight about. There's only the flow of loving kindness. So when bodhisattvas are committed to helping and loving and working on behalf of others, they don't need to pull and haul and push and shove to make that happen, because they know that they are the others and the others are them. And that makes bodhisattva helping natural and joyful, just like love itself. The bodhisattva path is imaginative, it's expansive, because the realization of emptiness as the true markless mark of existence makes it so. The early teachings of Buddhism in the Pali Canon are more or less straightforward instructions about how to practice. The Pali Suttas are on the whole pretty short texts, and although they do contain some supernatural elements here and there, the odd god or demigod flying around, mostly the teachings are rational, psychological, and that's why we like them, right? That's why they're so important and so useful to us. And that's why when Buddhism was first transmitted to the West, these early teachings were really prized, because they seem like refreshing, right? They're the opposite of sort of the Christianity, which is so much about faith and belief. These teachings are sort of very concrete and psychological. They're about how to improve your life with meditation practice. And they seem to have almost nothing to do with faith or religion. As you know, a lot of people think, well, Buddhism is not a religion because it's not about faith and belief and about a God. That's early Buddhism, the teachings that stand behind the mindfulness movement. On the other hand, Mahayana Buddhist texts are long, and very extravagant, full of supernatural elements, almost nothing but supernatural elements. In fact, they call them technically Vaipulya sutras, meaning extended, expanded sutras. And the Heart Sutra, which is a Mahayana sutra, of course, is the exception that proves the rule. It's one page long, but it's a distillation of many thousands of pages of text. That's why there's the Heart Sutra, because the emptiness texts are so vast and so many pages long that it felt like you needed a one-page schematic to show the whole range of teachings. But because they're so, extravagant and expansive, a lot of Western Zen students, Dharma students in general, don't like Mahayana sutras. They seem too superstitious and supernatural. And they seem to give you almost no practical instructions for how you're actually going to do Buddhism. So you could say, more or less, there's two kinds of Mahayana sutras. One kind that harps on emptiness, constant, emptiness, emptiness, emptiness. There's lots of sutras like that. And then there are those who don't mention emptiness much, but seem to clearly assume the emptiness teachings. So right now in our Everyday Zen community, we're coming into the home stretch, the last week or 10 days or so of our fall practice period. And we've been studying, as Mark mentioned, the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the not about emptiness sutras. And like the emptiness sutras, though, the Lotus Sutra is pretty early text. And it's a really important sutra for Far East Asian Buddhism, all the Buddhisms that come from Chinese cultural influence, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, other places. All those Buddhisms really honor the Lotus Sutra, less so in India and therefore in Tibet. It's known in those cultures, but somehow or other it didn't capture the imagination of those cultures the way it did in the Far East. There was a famous monastic named Kumarajiva, 4th century Central Asian monk who was known for his great brilliance. He was actually kidnapped by the emperor of China so that he could be brought to China, learn Chinese, and translate Buddhist texts into Chinese, which he did. He set up a vast translation bureau in China, which produced thousands of translations that in a short period of time flooded China, causing a revolution in understanding. Buddhism, of course, was already in China, but with Kumarajiva's time, it totally transformed. And this flood of new texts became really confusing to the Chinese. The Chinese had, of course, by this time, a very sophisticated religious and literary culture. But that culture was based on really just a handful of primary texts with commentaries, like the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the Chuangzi, and a few texts like that were the basis of Chinese literary culture. But here come all these Indian sutras, thousands of them. And everyone began, as all sutras do, with the words, "Thus have I heard," meaning that these sutras were all supposed to be the words of the Buddha, not commentaries, but primary spiritual texts. And they had different doctrines and practices. Maybe they were somehow related, but it was not at all clear how they were related. So our culture is the same, right? We have the Bible. We don't have like 1,000 different Bibles. We have the Bible, and there are some other texts, but they're secondary to the Bible. It would be as if all of a sudden in our culture, we discovered 10, 20, 50, 100, 1,000 different Bibles, all of them just as valid, right, as the Bible that we had before. It would be confusing. All of a sudden, everybody would say, whoa, we thought we knew what we were doing, but now we're not so sure. So that's the position that the Chinese were in. How did all of this stuff fit together? Now, in India, apparently, I don't know why exactly, but this did not present so much of a problem. Maybe because in India, the literary religious culture was already pretty wild. It was natural to them. Maybe because the texts appeared over a longer period of time, so they could be sort of digested. But the Chinese were really bewildered by this. So by the 6th century, the great Buddhist scholar Zhi had put together a system that explained all this. He had a kind of hierarchy of sutras, a system that never existed in India, but it did in China because of this special problem. So there were a hierarchy of different sutras, and he sort of imagined that hierarchy mapped onto the Buddha's life. In other words, he taught these things in the beginning that were very simple and easy to understand, and then he graduated onto more deeper, more ineffable teachings. That was Zhi's detailed system. And at the pinnacle of that system, the king of all the sutras, the one that was really the ultimate teaching of the Buddha, was the Lotus Sutra. And it's thanks to his system that the Lotus Sutra became so important all over China. And Zhi started a school in China called the Tiantai school, which became a very powerful Chinese Buddhist school. And that Tiantai school was transmitted to Japan, called in Japan Tendai. And in the Kamakura period of Japan, which is the medieval period around the time of Dogen, it was by far the dominant school of Buddhism in Japan. So Dogen, Shinran, and Nichiren, who were the three of the four most important founders of new Buddhisms in the Kamakura period, all of them had been ordained as Tendai monks. And so they were all, with the exception of Shinran, who rejected it, the others were devotees of the Lotus Sutra and remained so all their lives because they believed, just along with Juri, that it was the highest expression of the Buddhist teaching. And Dogen continued to be a devotee of the Lotus Sutra his whole life. Nichiren who was the founder of probably most of the Japanese schools of Buddhism that still exist. He loved the Lotus Sutra so much, he thought the entirety of Buddhist practice could be reduced to just chanting the name of the Lotus Sutra, right? Yoho Renge Kyo. Many schools of Buddhism now, that's their practice, to chant that. So I guess you guys have lineage through Maizumi Roshi in Soto Zen, as we do. So we all appreciate the teachings of Dogen Zenji. And so we know that Zazen is our practice, and we're familiar with Dogen's way of presenting Zazen. Even though the practice that we do appears to be pretty much identical to the practice of meditation in early Buddhism, Dogen didn't think of Zazen that way, as a meditation technique to achieve nirvana. For Dogen, Zazen was a practice completely in accord with the Lotus Sutra teaching that all beings are originally Buddhas, and all they need to do is to know that. And that's why, in Dogen's way of looking at things, and I guess you hear this too from your teachers, we're doing Zazen not to get enlightenment and improve our mind and our character. We're doing Zazen because we are already enlightened Buddhas. And that's what enlightened Buddhas do. They do Zazen. So probably they don't tell you this at first when you come to the center, because that would be a little hard to believe. It would sound a little bit like a faith practice. So maybe we don't emphasize that in the beginning. But after a while, 10, 20 years of doing Zazen, you kind of get the idea that, yeah, that's right, it feels right. We appreciate Zazen, and we are devoted to it. And although we make an effort, of course, we're not striving overmuch, right, in our Zazen practice. We strive just enough to remember our Buddha self, sitting up straight and breathing with our full dignity. But we're sitting there in full identity with all beings who are equally, in the very moment of our doing Zazen, Buddhas with us. Like I say, we might not be sitting there thinking that thought, but in a way, we demonstrate that in our devotion to Zazen practice without trying to get something out of it. So the Lotus Sutra opens up with a kind of miracle. As always, the scene is set. The Buddha is presiding over an immense assembly, including his historical disciples, and they're named monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, but also in attendance are many celestial bodhisattvas, all sorts of gods and demons and heavenly creatures and deity kings, and on and on and on. And before he preaches the Lotus Sutra, he preaches a sutra called Innumerable Meanings, in which he says that the teaching has innumerable meanings, infinite meanings, meanings beyond meanings. And yet all meanings are at the same time the meaning of the Sutra of innumerable meanings. And after he preaches that preliminary sutra, he enters into samadhi and he shoots out a beam of light from his forehead. And this beam of light illuminates vast numbers of worlds in the easterly direction. And Manjushri, the bodhisattva of the wisdom of emptiness, seeing this light shooting out from the Buddha's head, realizes it's a sign that the Buddha is about to preach the Lotus Sutra, the greatest of all sutras. So that's how the sutra begins. So one thing that's famous about the Lotus Sutra is its parables. It has a number of well-known parables. And, it's 28 chapters and many hundreds of pages long. But a lot of people think, and I agree, that when you analyze the Lotus Sutra, it seems like there actually is no Lotus Sutra. In other words, the Lotus Sutra is talking about the Lotus Sutra. All of it, all 28 chapters are really about why the Lotus Sutra is so great, why it's so important, why the other sutras that came before it and all the other teachings that came before it are all preliminaries to it. All that Buddha is teaching all the time about how great the Lotus Sutra is and how you should really honor it and believe in it. You should recite it, you should copy it, you should share it with other people. Doing that is more important than any other practice. So there's on and on and on about how great the Lotus Sutra is and why it's important, how it's important. But actually, when you think about it, literally, he never actually starts preaching the Lotus Sutra in the whole Lotus Sutra. It ends and there's no Lotus Sutra there. You don't notice that, because it's so engaging. But when you think about it, well, wait, what happened? So I really appreciate this, right? The greatest sutra never told. The greatest of all truths never spoken. And as Zen students, don't we find this quite familiar, right? Isn't that just like Dogen? Isn't that just like the Zen koan? So this is a reason why a lot of people, find Zen, like especially Dogen, baffling and unsatisfactory, because you want something, right? And here's something that proposes to be so very, very important and essential, and yet you can never pin it down. And that's why people sometimes think, in fact, even in the beginning of Zen's transmission to the West, they used to say this. They used to say, well, this is just slippery stuff to defeat your mind. So we might think, these teachings are somehow a trick. But it's not a trick. The Buddha way is about freedom, radical freedom. And it's also about love. And it's about how these two always go together. In fact, they're the same. If you really understand freedom with wisdom, it's love. And if you really understand love, it's not just emotion, it's freedom and wisdom. And to hold to a fixed truth is to be bound by that truth. And to be bound by a truth is to be limited in your loving. Not that there's no truth. There is truth. But no one can define it. No one owns it. no one can grasp it. You can only live the truth and love the truth and know that you can't know it. And you know what? It's really hard to be arrogant when you're aware that you don't know anything more than anyone else. And when you know that everyone is always fully expressing the truth, whether they think so or not. So one of the most important, inspiring teachings of the Lotus Sutra, even though it's never said, but you, by implication, you get this, is the teaching of universality, which carries over into Zen and Dogen fully. In other words, all beings, without exception, are already Buddha. All beings, including oneself, are worthy of love and support and respect. Awakening is not something that the elite will achieve as a result of their skillful practice. Awakening is the birthright of everyone. All dharmas are empty means that all beings are Buddha right now. Maybe we might think this was always the teaching in Buddhism, but really in early Buddhism, it was not. In early Buddhism, awakening literally was something only high achievers could manage. But in the Mahayana sutras, all of them really, this idea is satirized. The awakening of the arhats, the heroes of early Buddhism, from the standpoint of Mahayana sutras, that awakening is considered misguided and small-minded. And in the Mahayana sutras, the arhats are sometimes objects of ridicule. That's why Shariputra, who was a representative of early Buddhism, is a character in the Heart Sutra. O Shariputra, right? Avalokiteshvara, the celestial bodhisattva of loving kindness and compassion, is addressing the words of the Heart Sutra to Shariputra, the ultimate old school arhat. He's a hero in the early sutras, but in the Mahayana sutras, he's a kind of comic figure. Basically, the Heart Sutra is, you could say, a joke on Shariputra. Avalokiteshvara is saying to Shariputra, you think, Shariputra, that there are 5 skandhas, 18 dhatus, 4 noble truths, that there's knowledge, that there's attainment, and you think that you have attained nirvana, but ha, Shariputra, none of these things are real. They're all empty. And everybody knows it but you. That's what the Heart Sutra is really saying. You could read the Heart Sutra as a kind of practical joke on Shariputra. Well, Shariputra also appears in the Lotus Sutra. And in the Lotus Sutra, he's a little bit depressed because he now gets it after he hears, some of the things the Buddha is saying about the Lotus Sutra. He says, oh no, I missed the boat. My understanding of Dharma is really low grade. And he sees all these other people who are rejoicing in the Lotus Sutra, and he feels left out. They all get it, but it's too late for me. I have this other thing, and now I realize it's inferior and it's too late for me. But the Buddha says, no, all beings are Buddhas. You're included in that. So you're already awakened. There's nothing to be glum about. It's not that his understanding of the teachings is not true. It's just that they're true in a different way from the way that he thought they were true. all teachings are true. It's one of the points of chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra. All teachings are true and also false, because all teachings are empty of themselves. All teachings are just skillful means toward an unspeakable teaching. So Shariputra's understanding wasn't wrong. What was wrong was that he thought his understanding was right. And then he thought it was wrong. That's what was wrong. In fact, everything expresses awakening. And then hearing all this, Shariputra is much, much cheered up. And this teaching of universal awakening sounds really good to us Americans, because it sort of rhymes with the values our country was founded on, right? America is unusual in its idealistic founding, the documents that define our nationhood are very idealistic documents that are really about justice and equality for all, right? It says in our beloved Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable rights. Everyone has this right. So that's why I think a lot of Americans really like Mahayana Buddhism, because it really seems like a very American perspective. But nowadays, I think that's one reason why, despite everything, around the world, people have looked to America, because it's not only America now that aspires to that ideal. As a matter of fact, it's official in the world ever since 1948, the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, theoretically anyway, says that the whole world, anyway, the world that belongs to the United Nations, officially subscribes to the ideal of universal, inalienable human rights. And that, I think that because we have this ideal and because we value it, which is beautiful, right, is one of the reasons why the moment we're living in now is so shocking and discouraging. Because we're learning now, not that we haven't learned this before, but we're learning it freshly now, that although we might be very sincere about our belief and our faith and our love for universal inclusion and universal human rights, we haven't ever really practiced it. In fact, in a very broad brush way, you could say that this is the march of human history, a march toward, a long march toward universal inclusion and universal human rights, which begins first with full exclusion and paranoia. Only our little tribe is good, everybody else is something wrong with them. Let's stay away from them, let's fight with them. And then extending more and more and more, bigger and bigger, our group to include larger groups and tribes and nation states. And the struggle to open the heart more and more, to hope for, to desire full inclusion. It was a new idea, full inclusion and inalienable rights for everybody. That was a brand new idea in the 18th century. And then, after the promulgation of the idea, the effort to make that idea real, to actually have full inclusion in our societies, just like the Lotus Sutra preaches and the Declaration of Independence preaches. And it's painful to wake up to the fact that we're very far from. So, exclusion is easy to understand. It's natural to us, right, to want to feel the comfort and security of our exclusive group. You know, it's part of who we are. So we shouldn't condemn ourselves for it. I remember, for example, the first time that I visited Israel, a long time ago. And it was Shabbat. And I remember the wonderful feeling, which I had never felt before in my life, that the whole world was participating in Shabbat. Because everywhere I looked, the streets were full of people going to their synagogues. On every block, there was a synagogue. Everybody was joyful and happy. It was really beautiful. And I never felt that before. It was a beautiful feeling. But I'm a Jew, right? Maybe I didn't notice around there that there were some non-Jews who did not share in this wonderful feeling. Maybe even felt threatened by it. So I can understand how some, probably many, as we see from our recent election, maybe many Americans feel some kind of feeling about being American that only includes certain kinds of people, not others. Maybe others who are actually Americans are not included in their feeling of being American. So I understand it. And it explains, you know, that feeling, which could be a very positive, beautiful feeling. It would explain things like our current immigration policies or our racial exclusionary, paranoid racial feelings that some people have. And it plays out in who and how the vote is made available. And we think nowadays of all of this in terms of power and control. And it is about power and control, but it wouldn't be so compelling if it didn't come from, you know, a real human feeling that has its positive aspects. So since we have had this really big deal election lately, I've been studying about, you know, a little bit about voting in America. So it was in the 1820s and 1830s that the revolutionary idea that all white men, even if you didn't own any property, could vote. That wasn't the case before that period. Because remember, built into the whole idea of democracy as it was conceived of in ancient Greece, and that was the model for America, assumed a face-to-face political discussion among educated and property-owning male peers. That's who participated in democracy. So the idea that there would be universal inclusion and that everybody would vote was not a part of the idea of democracy in the beginning. And it was not a part of American democracy in the beginning. George Washington was unanimously elected president, unanimously, because there were only a handful of people who elected him. The white guys who owned property elected him unanimously. It's hard to imagine that unanimously someone elected president now. It's impossible. So little by little, they extended the right to vote. In the 1820s and 30s, white males could vote. With the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868 after the Civil War. It was interesting. If you read that amendment, the first part says all citizens born in the United States, regardless of race, had all the rights of citizens, including the right to vote. But then in the second section of the 14th Amendment, it actually says this. I didn't know this. Maybe you didn't know this either. In the second section, it says, however, if you would like to exclude certain citizens from voting, and it didn't say this, but really meant African-American citizens, if you would like to exclude them from voting, that would be okay. You could do that. As long as you counted up how many people you excluded, and you didn't count that number for how many people in your state would, how many representatives you'd have in the Congress. As long as you did that, it was legal to exclude certain citizens from voting. Well, that was, of course, not such a great idea. So in a couple of years later, they passed the 15th Amendment, which said, no, everybody has the right to vote. You cannot exclude anybody from voting. And that was the law of the land starting then, even though, as we all know, loopholes allowed for the reality that African-American people in the South could not vote, even though they had the legal right to, constitutional right to. They could not vote until the Voting Rights Act of the mid-1960s. But all this is men. What about women? Well, when they passed the 15th Amendment, giving all males born in the United States the right to vote in the late 19th century, women were not happy about this, right? You give Black men the right to vote, but what about Black women? What about white women? And it took another 50 years till 1920, till the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote, which is amazing when you think about it, because women began noticing the injustice of not having the right to vote in around 1820. So for 100 years, women agitated for the right to vote. And nowadays, can you imagine someone suggesting that women don't have the right to vote? I mean, it would be not only outrageous, but it would be bizarre and ridiculous. So we've made some progress there in our effort to include one another. So now we had our big election, and we're still arguing about, right now, we're in the middle of arguing about who gets to vote and whose votes count and whose votes don't count and how are votes counted and by who. Do you know the idea of voter fraud and the effort to suppress votes using the concept of voter fraud as an excuse goes back to the time of the 14th and 15th Amendments and the 19th Amendment. It comes out of the fact that some people are convinced, sincerely convinced, that when you include those people who should not really be included, naturally those people are going to do cheating. That's why you didn't want to include them. So voter fraud is a canard, perhaps even a sincere one, on the part of people who never felt comfortable about inclusion in the first place. So it's pleasant and easy to have an idea about universal inclusion, like our Constitution says and like the Lotus Sutra says. But as we see, it is not too easy to include everyone. Politically, socially, but even in your own heart, it's not so easy. Think about it. Don't you like the people who sort of are like you, kind of agree with the way you see things? Don't we like those people and not like so much the other people? Because we like to feel validated. We like to feel that the way we look at things is the right way. And that those who look at things radically differently, see the world radically differently, well, they're wrong. As I said before, it's a very positive and beautiful feeling, our feeling of solidarity within our group. That's why I guess probably you guys are just like we are at Everyday Zen. We really love our Sangha. Because in our Sangha, we feel, comfortable and loved and appreciated by everyone. Everyone sort of understands us and we understand them, and it's a wonderful thing to be together. But the Heart Sutra and the Lotus Sutra propose a much more radical idea. And they're saying that see past your comfortable views and feel that same feeling of love and support, not only in your Sangha, but everywhere. Everywhere, including people who don't agree with you. That's universal inclusion. There are no groups. There's only one group, sentient beings, and we are committed to taking care of all of them, excluding none of them, hating none of them. This is hard to do. It's hard to feel, certainly even in our hearts, we have to admit, right? We don't necessarily feel that, even though we wish we did. And it's even harder, of course, to create a world in which universal inclusion, or as close as we can get to it, actually exists. And so I think we could feel good about us human beings, that even though we have a long way to go, we are actually little by little working on that. We're trying. And in fact, if you think about it, we've come a long way. But it's frustrating to realize how long we still have to go. Loving everyone and seeing everyone as Buddha doesn't mean that we cannot disagree. Buddhas can disagree. It doesn't mean we can't have a firm view about our best understanding of how to bring about a just and fully inclusive world. So we can have those opinions and views, and we can hold fast to them. Because if we care about sentient beings, we have to have some way of caring for them, having a view about society that would bring about caring for them. Personally, in my opinion, the way I see things, and it's just my own view, which I can't help but have, I don't see how bodhisattvas would not want everyone to be fed every day, would not want everyone not to have shelter and safety and access to education and medical care, everybody, regardless of their circumstances. To me, this seems like an obvious desire that bodhisattvas would have. Now, I don't know how, it's complicated when you have a lot of people. How do you bring this about without destroying other things and making more problems? I don't know how to do that. I'm not a social engineer. I have no idea how to do that. But I want that to happen. To me, seems like, how could you not, as a bodhisattva aspirant? Because bodhisattvas want always everyone to be cared for. And they want no one to have trouble or harm. So I have a political point of view that comes from that desire. Even though I'm not sure how to bring it about, I make my best guess. So Mahayana Buddhism has a beautiful, sweeping vision of a future in which all beings are loved and respected and fully cared for. And it's a beautiful vision because it says this is guaranteed. The Mahayana vision is that this is guaranteed to occur at some point in the future. And that vision of Mahayana Buddhism is not really different in hardly at all from a similar vision that you find in the Abrahamic traditions. So that tells you that this vision of full inclusion, full care, and full respect for all beings is a projection of something very real in the human heart. And this is why, as practitioners, we always have a great hope for the future, a confident hope for the future, even though we can be quite aware of, bad things happening. And as I said in the beginning, grieving in our time is a very important part of our practice, to grieve over the setbacks and the struggles that people have to endure along the way to this vision. And we know we don't have to be deep students of history to know that bad things, really bad things, do happen. And also every day, good things happen, even in dark times. In the future, proposed by Mahayana Buddhism, doesn't come about because God decrees it or because it's fated. Buddhism teaches causality. Myriad causes and conditions produce each moment of the present. And those myriad causes and conditions include our own actions of body, speech, and mind. So in other words, we don't sit politely and wait for perfection to occur in the world. We are part of the creation of that beautiful world. And so every single day, not only with our, what we might call our political or social actions, but every action, every thought, every word, every deed, even our Zazen practice is part of the causality that brings about that future. So in these times, I feel like doing our practice, sharing it with others as they wish, is a good thing to do. It's a real force for good in the middle of this crazy, troubled world. And that's why I feel like it's a blessing for me, to be able to share my thoughts about this with you today. And I can't tell you how happy I am that all of you are practicing, because all of you are participating in this drop by drop by drop ocean wave that brings on a beautiful future. So thanks a lot for inviting me and giving me a chance to talk to you and meet you. So I stopped there and bowed to you. And now I guess we have some way of conversation.
Roshi, thank you. Thank you so much, Roshi. It's wonderful. Shikan, do you want to take over from here with questions and answers for Roshi?
Questions for Roshi? I know we have a few minutes left. I hope Roshi you have a few minutes for questions.
Sure.
Well, do you want us to put in the chat box or raise our hand or what?
Why don't we try this? Why don't we try raising our hand? Well, the problem is we have so many. So why don't we try chat box and I'll try to recognize you.
Do you know about the blue hand?
Yeah, maybe that.
The blue hand works pretty well. If you click on the participants box, participants on the bottom of the screen, you'll see an icon on the far left, which is a blue hand that looks like this, only it's blue. If you click on that, then Michael will be able to see your name. It'll pop to the top of the list and then he can call on you.
On some of these, it says raise hand, same.
Mm-hmm.
Tatiana, I see you have your hand raised.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. The beginning of the Lotus Sutra, not at the very beginning, but a little bit inside after Buddha starts talking about universality and how everybody can attain Buddhahood, etc. What happens is many hundreds and thousands of arhats, etc., 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 get up and leave because they are not happy to be part of that vision.
Right.
So universality does not necessarily exist unless we want to be part of it. And that mind frame is such a terrible problem for the world, because people do not want to be part of something universal. So if you could say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wonderful moment in the sutra. It's 5,000 people. I often think of this, if I'm giving a Dharma talk, how would I feel if 5,000 people got left in the middle of my Dharma talk? I think I would not feel as nonplussed as the Buddha felt. Well, right, but it doesn't say this in the Lotus Sutra, but to me, like the implication of the Lotus Sutra would be, I would interpret it, I would say, these 5,000 arhats got up and left, but that was temporary. That was their karma of that time, and that eventually they too would be included. I don't, because I think that in fact, later on in the sutra, there's a chapter about Devadatta. Devadatta, who was, the most evil person, almost, I guess you could say the most evil person in the history of Buddhism, who tried to kill the Buddha and so on and so on. If anybody would be excluded, right, it would be Devadatta, who committed the heinous crimes. But Devadatta, we learn in that chapter, is included. Devadatta is also included. And we learn in that chapter that Devadatta in a previous lifetime was the Buddha's teacher. So I think that although it doesn't say this in the sutra about these 5,000, in the spirit of the sutra, you probably can say that these 5,000 at a later time turn out to be the Buddha's teacher, and that they too are included, even though in that moment they did not want to be involved and included in the teaching. And certainly when we look at the world and our own lives, we see that people, yeah, you're right, people do not, when they hear about universal inclusion, they don't like it. They resist. They strike out against it. We know that. So we have to learn how to cope with that and how to practice with that. You might have views of which to you, from your point of view, are benign, compassionate views, and then someone might curse you and vilify you for having those views. And so we have to be ready to cope with that and deal with that. Later on in the sutra, there's another chapter about the great Bodhisattva, never disparaging, who goes around loving beings and bowing to them and telling them how much he respects them. And then they throw things at him and they yell at him and they give him a hard time. And he copes with that. And he draws strength from his need to practice patience with that. But he never gives up his loving them and respecting them. So I think that's true also of those 5,000 bodhisattvas. And we have to learn how to do that too. We have to learn how not to hate people, even though they appear to be rejecting kindness and compassion. We know that there's something more in them than that, even though in this moment, that's the way they're behaving. Oh, does that speak to what you were raising?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Roshi, we have one more question if you have a few more, another minute.
Sure, I got time, yeah.
Eve?
So I've been wondering about leadership and followership and its relation to teaching and who people accept as their teachers. I teach in a public health leadership program, and in the past year, the role of leadership and the problems with flawed leadership have been all too apparent. And it's hard to be satisfied with drop by drop when people are dying. And when you talk about social engineering, remember that I think one of the challenges is that if you're trying to support love and wisdom and freedom, you can't tell people what to do. And I was wondering if you would comment on your role as a teacher and how you see that, and what relationship that has to leadership.
Well, I suppose leadership in Dharma practice might be different from leadership in a social organization or political organization. I actually don't know what people should do, so I don't tell people what to do. And I appreciate everybody's understanding of the Dharma. I don't know that I have like the right understanding of the Dharma, and so people should listen to me. I'm wrong a lot, and I changed over the years. So that means that my view of today can't possibly be like the right view. That won't change tomorrow or the next day. But then again, that's just how I look at it. I don't know. I would not say that's a universal prescription for Dharma leaders, but that's just how I look at it. However, if I were in a position of practical leadership, I would feel a need to be decisive and get advice about what's the best thing to do, and then do it and deal with the fallout. So in the case of, you're in public health, so I think in public health, we're talking about, you're right, lives are at stake. So there's no, as a person who's sharing Dharma, I could be very expansive and very open and not be directive. But if I were the public health officer, I would not take that view. I would say, no, this is what we need to do, because this is what the best information tells us, and we should do it this way. And if people disagree, I would do my best to deal with that. So, however, so leadership can be directive and I think and decisive, and there are times in which it absolutely needs to be. I mean, in the military, right? They have very strong traditions of obedience and hierarchy, on the theory that in the military, you're always in a situation where life and death are at stake. And so you need clear lines of authority and so on in that situation. So I think leadership is different in different situations, depending on what the institutions are and what's at stake and so on and so on. But in any case, I think that leadership that doesn't recognize the importance of love and respect for everyone is going to always be weak. Because if I have to issue directives, right, and tell you, never mind what you think, do this, right, you're going to do it a lot more effectively and a lot more readily if you know that I respect you and care for you and I'm making this decision because it's necessary, than if you think that I'm just an autocrat who's throwing his weight around. That's not as effective, I think. So I think the idea that seeing the people who you work with in the best possible light and nurturing them as a sense of taking care of relationships is always really, really important, it seems to me, in leadership. And nowadays, in leadership training programs, which you know better than I do, they're now based on, work on emotional intelligence and so on and so on. They're not about just being smart and getting the right idea. They're about people and working with people with a heart-to-heart connection. That's part of leadership now. I think everybody understands that. Is that what you find in your work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Roshi, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
A pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Norman.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roshi. Pleasure to meet you too.
Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, Roshi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norman.
I'm going to push
Thank
my
you.
little red leave, my little red leave
Norman.
button, and I'll disappear. So thanks, everybody. Oh, hi, Steve. I didn't know you were here today.
Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Oh,
Hi,
Martha,
Norman.
there's Martha. So some of my friends from Everyday Zen were here. I didn't quite.
Hi,
know.
Norman.
Hi,
Thank you,
Norman.
Everybody. By the way, you see that they all call me Norman because that's my name. They never call me Roshi because it freaks me out a little bit.
Okay, bye. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Norman.
Yes.
Thank you, Norman.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Norman.